reason that jokes don't travel very well is that they're based in the belief systems of a particular culture or time. Getting a joke usually involves being able to understand particular cultural values that underpin them. This paper is about one of those values, namely the central role military courage plays to the Greek concept of Andrea. In 5th and 4th century comedy and paroidia, that's a hexameter genre of poetry that parodies mostly epic, authors created humor from the juxtaposition of the martial expectations of Andrea and the more frivolous experience of the Symposium. And I have two aims specifically in this paper. First, I will argue that this type of joke is a good example of one way that the comic mode structures and maintains a specific model of masculine behavior in which courage and strength are central. Second, I want to look closely at how an understanding of humor helps us to construct this argument. So I'm going to start with situating this issue within humor studies so, as is well known, if and how humor affects or influences its audience is an issue that has been much debated, both inside and outside of classical scholarship. For gender humor in particular, this is related to the role of humor in the construction or deconstruction of gender hierarchies and boundaries. One influential figure on this issue is Mustafa Abedinifard. So, for example, he's analysed one Iranian joke cycle in which Qazvini men are consistently portrayed as predatory homosexuals and pederasts. Abedinifard suggests that this joke cycle, to quote him, punitively deploys ridicule as a method of supporting heteronormativity and homophobia. These jokes thrived especially on the 1979 Islamic Revolution under Ayatollah Khomeini, whose regime worked hard to suppress homosexuality through imprisonment and execution, among other things. In such a context, Abedinifard suggested that these Qazvini jokes could have worked to reinforce the emerging redrawing of the boundaries of proper masculine activity. Similar conclusions about the role of humor were drawn in social psychology studies. So James and Olson studied, for example, the effect of what they call jeer pressure, concluding that, and again to quote them, exposure to someone being ridiculed can have inhibiting effects on college students who were the object of their study, and that other ridicule, there's the ridicule of other people, appears to make observers aware of their own vulnerability to ridicule and rejection. At the same time, this view of humor's effects is by no means universally accepted. Most notably, Christy Davies has consistently denied the wider significance of jokes throughout a long career. In his response to Abedinifard's article on Qazvini men, Davies repeatedly refers to his arguments that jokes are, in his words, a weak force in society. And numerous times he's referred to his notorious metaphor that jokes are a thermometer, not a thermostat. In this debate, though, I stand closer to Abedinifard than to Davies, whose exculpatory approach to humour can lead to problematic positions, including the excusing of racist or anti-Semitic humour. At the same time, in this paper, because I've tried to give a detailed account of how humour in these fragments contributes to the meaning of a passage, in places I've also adopted some terminology from other accounts of humour. And in particular, I've used or made some use of Graham Ritchie's recent approach through cognitive science to the study of humour and jokes. My main argument here is that the trope I discuss shows how humour can perpetuate attitudes towards masculinity in classical Athens. I should note, though, that humour can play a variety of roles in relation to gender hierarchies. This is only one contributions to the special issue of the journal Social Semiotics that was edited by Simon Weaver, Raul Alberto Mora, and Karen Morgan, who's the third quotation on the handout. As the editors themselves note in their introduction to the volume, reducing the role of humour to a single role, whether this is reinforcing or resisting gender hegemony, would be far too simplistic. So with that established, let's have a look at some comic fragments and parodic fragments of depicting symposia. So I'll start with a sort of depiction of the ways this trope works and the context in which it appears, before turning more specifically to look at its use in political satire. Not only does this trope appear in many contexts, and it's used by numerous character types in comedy, but more specifically, we'll see that these jokes frequently frustrate audience expectations in a way that reinforces existing social norms and expectations. So we start with a fragment of the parodic poem Archestrus of Gala's Hedipatheia, a poem that set out where the best food and drink was to be found in the Greek world in the middle of the 4th century. Archestratus adopts a fairly conservative maximum of 5 people at the symposium. And this number is designed to keep the event orderly, as any more than this, and he says it would already be a mess group of rapacious mercenary soldiers. And the first line, half of the line 4 in particular, emphasizes the violent and individualistic characteristics that Archestratus wants to banish from the symposium. This fragment is a useful starting point for us because it demonstrates some of the key ways in which martial imagery and language interacts with the ideology of the symposium. On the one hand, Archestratus points to an opposition between order and violence, which by extension in some cases is framed as a contrast between the luxury of the symposium and the courage that's required on the battlefield. On the other hand, the spheres of the symposium and the battlefield also share an idealized elagitarianism and camaraderie, although this of course manifests quite differently in each area. And bit 39, the second example, in this context provides an interesting example of the manipulation of the similarities and contrasts between the battlefield and the symposium. The speaker and context of the fragment are uncertain, which is a running theme, but the speaker is essentially complaining about someone being late to a symposium and holding up the dinner. When you don't even have to contribute in order to attend, tardiness, the speaker says, is like abandoning your station in battle. Now, we don't take it entirely literally in order to get the point. Military desertion, an offence punishable by death, is clearly a comic hyperbole. What is significant is how these lines activate the underlying assumptions and beliefs held by its audience. The elements of the audience belief base that are activated in these lines are first that one's actions and behavior inside the symposium are or can be an accurate reflection of, or in some cases can reveal somebody's true nature. And second, that military desertion is a prototypical example of the same character trait, which you might call something like untrustworthiness or unreliability, that's demonstrated by being late for an assemblon deipnon. In other words, the joke reinforces the audience's existing belief regarding military desertion, as well as comically suggesting that men's true behavior can be sniffed out and policed within the symposium. So despite being an exaggeration, in fact, perhaps even because it's an exaggeration, we're encouraged to scrutinize men's behavior closely in order to root out the untrustworthy. My third example, I'll zoom out a little bit so you can see the translation as well. The third example features a typically boastful comic chef who attempts to draw a comparison between the techne of cookery and the skill of being a general. In contrast to any old general, a true general is distinguished by his ability to see and understand the situation and an ability to reverse a bad situation. These qualities of a good general are then contrasted with the skills of a good mageros, as opposed to a simple oxopoios, a preparer of fish. These skills are not simply everyday activities. No. It's about understanding where your food comes from, when it was harvested, understanding the needs of the host and his guests. Incidentally, I think this guy would make a great interviewee for Netflix's The Chef's Table for viewers of that show. An important aspect of the humor here is that the Aladzone chef himself is the target of the humor. He tries to use a comparison with the office of strategos in order to bolster his claims about the chef's import, but it's his stereotypical pomposity, the audience's pre-understanding of the character's traits, that undercuts his words. As before, the military sphere is evoked as a paradigm up to which the techne megedike can never stand. So far, I've demonstrated some of the variety and the ingenuity to which this trope is put, and I've tried to emphasize how a greater appreciation of the humor in each fragment allows us to see how the comic mode can reinforce hegemonic forms of masculinity. And this is a point we can build on more by looking at quite specifically at how this trope is used as a satirical tool. Political satire is an especially apt form for this trope because it affords writers opportunities to play with the mismatch between the military as a political public service and the symposium as a site of private activity and behavior. And it's here that we see tensions between these two worlds most clearly. I did realize as I was writing this that it would be impossible to comment on every relevant fragment, so I've tried to focus on two examples from comedy and one from paroidia. But I've also mentioned some of the other examples of the trope below on the handout. So most notably, and partially because it's been better addressed elsewhere, I've chosen not to go into too much detail about the notorious scene paralleling Dicæopolis' feast at the end of Acharnians and Lamachus's preparations for battle. But we can obviously raise this in questions if people have points to make. My first example for Theophilus, the speaker introduces a certain Atrestidas of Mantinea as a company commander. He's apparently a gifted and talented individual, although his talents are not related to his command, but to his appetite. And by paying close attention again to the dynamics and the structure of the joke here, we can see how the expected standards of courage and military skill are again held up as paradigms in contrast to the satired figure of Atrestidas. Stein of the fragment tells the audience essentially that Atrestidas of Mantinea is a lokagos. This introduction, an audience might reasonably expect, will be in some way salient to what follows. And this forecast by the audience is strengthened by the first words in the second line, describing him as the most capable of all men. It's the reversal in the last word, fagain, that forces us unexpectedly and humorously to reevaluate our understanding of the lines. And there are several aspects to the meaning of the joke that could be accessed by the audience. They wouldn't need to necessarily get every single element, but they would certainly get quite a few. On the one hand, we might recognize, for example, that despite the surprise ending of the lines, this is a remarkably appropriate trait for a military figure, as elsewhere comic soldiers can easily be portrayed as a glutton. At the same time, the idea that an important military figure is more with and more capable at eating than he is safety and command of his troops renders him a problematic and visible figure. Courage and martial ability are held up implicitly as the proper and appropriate ideals for a figure of addressed standing. It is the distance between these ideals and man himself that opens the door to this satirical depiction of him. Another famous fragment that deploys the same kind of trope is Lysimachus fragment 7 from his play entitled Philip. Unfortunately, much about this fragment is unclear, including the identity of the speaker and the context of the fragment. One of the only main points on which interpretations agree is that the speaker is clearly boastful and vainglorious. And the speaker also indicates that some fight may be about to occur in the first line between his troops and some interlocutor. This fight could be literal or metaphorical, such as perhaps a contest of words, or even a fight over food. Whatever exactly the case may be, the conflation between the symposium and the battlefield is used to emphasize the speaker's masculinity as he presents himself as a fearsome opponent that should terrify the person to whom he's speaking. Finally, I will turn to Matro of Pitani's Attikon Deipnon, a parodic poem from the last decade of the 4th century, which satirizes two of the prominent pro-democratic figures, Xenocles and Stratocles. And the key to understanding the humor in Matro as opposed to in comedy is that here we have a lot of parody of Homeric poetry, as will be clear as you look at the fragments. And at the start of the poem, Matro quickly establishes the character of Xenocles through a parody of the Caicoscopia, as Xenocles, as the host of the dinner, is somewhat unflatteringly compared to the description of Odysseus inspecting his men. But where Odysseus is actually a real hero and the troops he is inspecting are actual soldiers, Xenocles is merely the host of a dinner party who is still acting as if he were a big man, inspecting ranks of men who are actually just people waiting for their dinner. And it's this contrast between the world of the Homeric poems and the pathetic world of Xenocles' Symposium that fuels the satire throughout Matro's Deipnon. And in doing so, martial courage is again consistently held up as model masculine behavior through the use of this Homeric parody, in contrast to the absurd pomposity and excessive luxury that you find in this dinner party. And I can't go into all the details, but Matro's poem is filled with infighting between the symposiasts, at times literally tear into each other in their desire to get hold of the tastiest morsels of dinner, breaking kind of rules that Arcestus insisted on, and engaging in drinking competitions as they perform their own excess throughout the poem. And another example of Matro's use of Homeric parody to satirize the luxurious lifestyle of Xenocles and Stratocles comes at the end of the fragment, in lines that parody the notoriously spurious lines of the catalogue of ships that mention the presence of the Athenians at Troy. And there are two important aspects from these lines that sharpen Matro's satirical spear against Xenocles and Stratocles. First, the diners are served ducks from Salamis. Salamis, of course, had been an Athenian possession from the 6th century BC or so, but in 318, the islanders had voluntarily accepted a Macedonian garrison. So Xenocles serves, in other words, food from enemy territory that should rightfully be Athenian. Second, in line 97, we find a parody of, the parody of Homeric poetry stays very close to the original lines. The key difference between the two is the replacement of the verb histantor with katakentor. So rather than standing in the battle line, these symposiasts are spending their time reclining in leisure and living it up on fine food. And the shift between these verbs marks the disjuncture between the upright Homeric hero and the more horizontal plane of Matro's contemporary politicians. So this way, the parody invites us not only to compare the men of Matro's time to these Homeric heroes, but also to see the ways in which they fail to live up to these masculine ideals. So to conclude, I've tried to focus on two key points. First, I've suggested that the association and conflation of warfare and the Symposium is one way that comedy and parodia perpetuate traditional Athenian standards of masculinity. And second, I've focused on a specific strategy by which this is achieved. And this is important because mechanisms and theories of how humor works have been debated for decades and decades. And this is not a debate that I'm going to be able to end right now, and likely will never end. But in the analysis of these fragments, I've tried to emphasize how the evocation and disruption of audience expectation plays an important role in the way that the comic mode can reinforce discourses of gender. To do gender is not always to live up to normative conceptions of femininity or masculinity. It is to engage in behavior at the risk of gender assessment, to quote Candice West and Don Zimmerman. The different ways these texts evoke warfare and battle as a paradigm of masculine activity, whether as eating swords and swallowing flames in the Symmachus, these methods utilize audience associations and expectations in order to assess how these specific individuals, real or stereotypical, live up to them. In every example, characters consistently disappoint. Atrestidas's all-consuming appetites trumps the stateliness of his military position, while Dionysius's chef boasts of being as great as a general, but it's his pomposity that shows us just how absurd his pretentiousness is. Thank you very much, everyone. I will